Operationally, what Ukraine's been able to do is create a sort of zone defence in depth, making it extremely difficult for Russians to advance across their territory. They actually now call this the drone zone, and it stretches from 10 to 15 kilometres rearwards of the Russian front lines. And essentially within that drone zone, across the whole of the 1,000 kilometre front, it's almost impossible for Russians to move except on foot and at night. And even then, they can be targeted, but they're less vulnerable. What this means, it's almost impossible for the Russians to get together enough people to conduct an effective attack against the positions. The general rule, the kind of rule of thumb, if you like, in military operations, is it takes an attacking force needs to be at least 3 to 1 greater than a defending force. But because of the Russians' inability to move through this drone zone, which for them is a zone of death, it means it's almost impossible for them to make any significant progress, which is why we've seen across the whole front an advance which is slower even that of the Somme in 1916. And that is a remarkable change as well. And that's all down to drone warfare and the Ukrainian ability to make drone warfare their key defensive asset. Indeed, we understand that something like 80% of all the destruction that's taken place in this war, perhaps on both sides, has been occurred through drones. Drones have been around for a while, and those of us who fought in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were well used to seeing drones being operating as well. But the sheer scale of drones being used in the Russia-Ukrainian war is something none of us could necessarily have envisaged. It's estimated that Ukraine used some 9,000 drones a day, 9,000 drones a day, but their production is keeping up with it. By the end of 2024, Ukraine was producing over 4 million drones a year. Drone warfare is very much a sign of what's not going on in the Russia-Ukrainian war, but also a sign of the sophistication and development of Ukraine's own armed forces. What we're now seeing is a sophisticated use of drones against very specific targets. What the Ukrainians, and indeed the Russians, have been able to do is combine technology that's now starting to be quite well developed with the very latest in terms of navigation and targeting systems. The Ukrainians themselves are very conscious that the Russians can try and jam their operations, but also that if required, the Americans, as indeed we've seen, can turn off some of the navigation systems itself. What we're seeing here is an attack on a tower block in Kazan, inside Russia. Now, it looks awful attacking a tower block, but in fact, this is a very precise attack on a very specific floor in this tower block, in which all Russia's elite forces were housed. Again, using espionage, like the earlier attacks we saw with Operation Spiderweb, the Ukrainians identified the target and then used a very specific combination of the drone aircraft to attack them. So it's a pinpoint attack on this high-rise building, attacking very specific individuals in that building. And that's the value of this kind of drone warfare. What they're able to do is use precision attack against very specific targets. Here you can see the drone approaching the building and exploding. And indeed, we are told the residents were told to evacuate and get themselves into basements as quickly as possible after that. And you can see the scale of the damage it caused. But it was very precise damage indeed. This is one example of a particular type of attack by Ukrainian drones. But as I said earlier, drones are now very much a part of warfare across the whole. And 80% of the destruction of Russian equipment has occurred through drones themselves. The Ukrainians have been able to harness their technology, and really, and this is the really interesting development with this, also use a significant number of civilians in order to aid their effort. Indeed, they've got a whole unit who essentially are civilians who both planned, organised, and then integrated their efforts with those of the Ukrainian armed forces in order to defeat the Russians as a whole. And they've also become more sophisticated as soldiers, also to the point whereby the units which are best at using the drones get the next best bit of equipment. So they're encouraged to get better and better, to innovate and find their way through. It's worth noting, of course, that this is also a competition. The Russians are also using drones, and there's been a cycle, a very sort of creative, destructive cycle, quite correctly termed, whereby each side develops a drone technology, the other side tries to block it, the side then develops a counter to that. And so we have this kind of creative proliferation throughout this war as things go forward. And that's very much part of the scene. If you want a sense of the kind of spirit that motivates Ukraine, which has led them to this particular position, you can't do better than go right back to the beginning of the war. when President Zelensky, faced with what would look like a massive onslaught by Russia, was offered by America a way out. And he replied very bluntly, I need ammo, not a ride.
Тому що наша зброя – це наша правда. Наша правда в тому, що це наша земля, наша країна, наші діти. І ми все це будемо захищати. Ось і все. Ось це і є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
And that has set the tone for the way in which Ukraine has now dealt with this war. Of course, they're tired of the war. Of course, they want peace, but it's not going to be peace at any price. And even now, after 4 years of war and all their casualties, all the polling evidence suggests that Zelensky and the fight against Russia has the overwhelming support of the Ukrainian people. That is quite remarkable and something we should understand and commemorate. Ukraine isn't just surviving anymore. It's reshaping how modern wars are fought. Not in the future, but right now. The real question is, how far will this go?
Слава Україні! Героям слава!
What the Ukraine-Russia war has shown is yet again, of course, is that necessity is the mother of invention. But from this position, can Ukraine actually overtake Russia? Not just in the immediate future in terms of fighting this war, but sufficiently to prevent Russia from attacking in future. Some of that's down to weapons and weapon systems, but the level of innovation and adaptation they'll be able to show, they all need to maintain in the future, because Russia will go back, lick its wounds, and try and look again to see whether they can take even more of Ukraine. And so Ukraine needs to keep that pressure up. And that's the real question. Can they keep that going into the future? The question we posed right at the very beginning was whether or not Russia was going to be surpassed by Ukraine. And I would argue that potentially it is. And in a number of areas. One is their ability to generate forces, which is actually better at the moment than the Russians themselves. But I would say the key thing is their agility and their ability to be adaptive. Russia itself, while it has vast potential, vast resources, and a sophisticated defense industry, nonetheless seems incapable of adapting quickly to the changing battlefield conditions. I think this is the key thing in terms of Ukraine's emergence as a military superpower, because what they've been able to do in the heat of battle, under massive pressure from the Russians, and even in the face of significant casualties, have nonetheless been able to adapt and innovate faced with that pressure. And I think that's also an indication of emerging superpower status. If you look back at history, and you look back at those times when different countries have dominated the world for a period of time, it's usually been when they have been at their most technically and technologically innovative. Ukraine is right on the cusp of that at the moment. And that's why I believe, why I understand that Ukraine may well emerge